Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or evening if you're watching this on YouTube at a different time of the day, but really good to be with you today. And 2021, what a year it's been as we come into this new year. I don't know how you're feeling as you look ahead into the new year, whether you're feeling hopeful or whether you're feeling like you've had enough, or whether you're kind of between the two on different days and or even different times of the day, depending on what's going on. But these are not easy days to walk through by any measure at all. I mean, who knew we'd be here this time last year? Yet here we are, and we're still called, if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, we're still called to walk by faith and not by sight as we head into this new year, and right through this whole season we've just been through. And that's what I want to speak about this morning. We're going to start a new preaching series next week based out of the book of Philippians called Joy on the Journey. But today I want to speak about faith. And I don't know what you think about when you hear the word faith. If you're not a Christian, maybe it conjures up images of belief in spite of evidence, or close your eyes and kind of hope it's true. Maybe that's what some might think a Christian's faith is. I read two articles over the Christmas holidays that just had the word faith in. One of them was about faith in humanity, faith in science and these kinds of things. And the other one was about faith in a person's, in their self, and having faith in yourself. And that's a phrase we hear sometimes. Have faith in yourself. Have confidence in who you are and what you're able to do and achieve. Before Christmas, actually, I preached on hope and talked about the hope that we have with the vaccine that's coming, and it's not wrong to do that, to have hope. But I also talked about there how that hope has to be based on a foundation. That hope is based on a foundation of faith and trust. That we're trusting others to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. We're trusting the scientists and the pharmaceutical companies and the NHS and so on to roll it all out for the vaccine and so on. We're trusting others. I can't do this. I don't have the skills. I don't have the ability at all. And so hope rests on a foundation of faith, trusting in others' words, their promises, and trusting in others' works, their ability to do what they said they would do. And a Christian's faith isn't static. It's not a sort of belief in a set of religious principles. The Christian faith is a journey. It's a lived out and a living out the promises of God. It's living out following Him. This is why the majority of the Bible is a story, not a set of philosophical sort of lists that we follow to improve our lives. And we're going to focus in on one passage, one whole chapter. I'm not going to read out the whole chapter at all, but Hebrews chapter 11. That is a well-known passage for many that gives many examples of people who lived by faith. I think the word faith is mentioned like 24 times in this one chapter. And by faith, this phrase, by faith, is mentioned around 18 times like a drumbeat through this passage. That if you want to follow God, if you want to follow Jesus, it's by faith and by faith. And it was written to encourage Christians as well in Hebrews 11, to persevere, to endure, to stand firm in difficult days. And I want to focus in on one character in this story, sometimes known as the father of faith, and that's Abraham. I'm going to read from verses 8 to 12 in Hebrews 11. So if you've got a Bible, open it up or flick it on your pad or whatever it is, or phone. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even to that one man, and him as good as dead, at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and the innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. By faith, just 3 times in those verses that we read out there. And the first thing we read here is about faith, and what it means to walk by faith is faith hears and obeys. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, he obeyed. This is relating back to the story you can read in Genesis at the beginning of the Bible, chapter 11, verse 31 talks about there where Abraham was called by God. He left Ur of the Chaldeans. This was a big city. This was a place of comfort and luxury for that day. It was the kind of place that you might put down roots and settle down in. I mean, Abraham could have said to God, well, look, I'm 75 years old now. Life is good. I'm up for retirement. I'm comfortable. The kids are settled. Work is good. Future's looking bright. But, maybe I'll stay. But Abraham's not called the father of faith because he stayed. He's called the father of faith because he obeyed and he trusted God. His obedience was an outward expression of his faith. In the letter of James, Jesus' brother who writes that letter, he says there that, you show me your faith, and I'll show you my faith by what I do, by my works, by my actions, by my obedience. Now, I don't know how you feel when you hear the word obey. One meaning of the word obey is to submit to authority. But why would you do that? That would be a question I would ask. If someone asked me to submit to what they're saying and obey what they're saying, I need to know what authority do you have to say those things. See, it depends on who is doing the asking. I mean, if you're driving down the road, and let's say you don't know me at all, and maybe you don't, and I'm standing in the middle of the street, and you're driving down the road, and I stop your car, stand in the middle, and tell you to stop and go a different direction, not to come this way. You might well do right to question me and question what authority do I have to tell you to do that. And you might likely drive around me thinking, well, I don't know who that nutter was. Yet if it was the police who stood in the way, if a policeman stood or a policewoman stood in the way on the street and stopped you, you might more likely listen to them and turn around thinking, even if they didn't give you a good reason, if you said, well, why? And they said, well, I can't tell you. You're more than likely to trust their authority because of who they are. So our obedience is based upon the authority, who is telling us to do this thing. And in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus says this. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Listen to that again, that claim that Jesus is making. All authority, not some authority, not a little bit of authority, but total authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. And therefore, Jesus says, go into all the world, teaching people to obey everything that I've said. Everything. Jesus is claiming ultimate authority. As you look through the Gospels, he is saying this is God with us. We've just had Christmas, obviously, the incarnation. This is God incarnate, God become flesh, God moved into the neighborhood in the person of Christ. And that's why we listen to him. Now, the analogy of the police sort of breaks down at this point because that's an authority figure that you might not even know, yet you may obey. But if they're not there, maybe you might not. But actually, the Christian's response of obedience to God is based upon relationship. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey me. He's not saying, hey, obey me to prove your love to me, although maybe it does demonstrate that. I think there's something more here that Jesus is saying, if you love me, you will obey me. If you're living out of this relationship of knowing the love of God in your life, of loving God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength, you'll actually want to please God. You'll want to listen to what he says and follow his direction. Even when following him is inconvenient. Even when it's stopping you and saying, look, I don't want you to come down this way. I want you to turn down that way now. Even when it's a different direction. Even when it is costly for our lives. We trust God. There's a phrase I'm trying to live with at the moment that says this. It says, don't try to manage outcomes, but trust God with the results of obedience. Don't try to manage what's going to happen after you trust God, the outcomes, but trust God with the results of obedience. I'm trying to live that way because I can so easily fall into the trap of, well, what's going to happen and what might happen if I obey God in this? We trust God. You see, the second thing here is faith doesn't just hear and obey. Faith steps out even when the way is unclear and when it's unfamiliar and even when it's uncertain. I don't know if you've ever done a trust fall. When you stand up and you keep your feet in one place on the floor and you just lean back your body back and someone is behind you and their promise is to catch you and for you not to fall and crash to the floor. And to trust them is to keep your feet in the same place as you lean back and not kind of put a foot back, as it were, just to kind of catch yourself. In one sense, Abraham going out, he was putting his whole self, his family, in the hands of God. It says in verse 8, by faith he went out, not knowing where he was going. I kind of imagine the children in the back of the camel or whatever it was at the time, kind of, are we nearly there yet? Well, I don't know, because I don't know where we're going. Are we nearly there yet? Well, I'm not too sure yet, but God will let us know when we kind of get there. Phil Moore, in one of his excellent commentaries in the Straight to the Heart series, says this: the Lord will almost certainly require us to step out before we clearly see the destination, the resources, or the confirmation. Listen to that again. God will almost certainly require us to step out before we clearly see the destination, the resources, or even the confirmation. And that will look different in different seasons of our lives, what it means to step out in faith. Sometimes it might mean going. And this year, Tim and Emma went up to Liverpool. So many of you will know them. And that's a step of faith, not having a house, not knowing how they were going to land in Liverpool and so on. They went out in faith. Sometimes it means going geographically, like Abraham left. Other times it's different steps of faith that God calls us to, maybe with our finances, maybe in a work situation, in a family, all sorts of ways. And rather than me sort of list out ways, maybe spend time at the beginning of the year asking God, what does a step of faith look like for me this year? What does it look like today? What does it look for me to sort of trust you, with everything that I have? What's it going to look like for you? What's it going to look like as a church for us in 2021? We don't know. But God calls us to walk by faith, even when the way is unclear or unfamiliar, and when we don't know fully what the destination in this land looks like. But why would you do a trust fall? Why would you do one? Would you let me catch you, as it were? Do you trust me enough for that? Do you trust the person, if you're with someone watching this, do you trust them to catch you in a trust fall? You see, the reason we would do a trust fall is because of the person who is standing behind us. We trust their strength. We trust their ability. We trust their faithfulness to do what they say they would do. I like this quote from, I think, Jim Cymbala. He's an American pastor, and he wrote a book called Fresh Faith. And he says, never try to have more faith. Just get to know God better. And because God is faithful, the better you know him, the more you will trust him. Don't try to conjure up more faith. Get to know God better. And I realize that with that, sometimes things don't go the way we want. We step out in faith. We trust what God says. And things don't go the way we expected. Sometimes maybe we feel God hasn't come through on a situation that we've prayed about. We feel God's promised on. Thankfully, in Hebrews 11, it doesn't just paint this kind of picture of success in the sense of just that everything works out how each person planned it. In fact, it doesn't always end the way we might want. In verse 35 and 37, it talks about, it says, women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release. So that people experienced mockings and scourgings and chains and imprisonment. Verse 37, some were stoned. This is by faith. Were stoned, were sawn in two, were tempted, were put to death by the sword, and so on. It goes on. It doesn't always end up the way we might think. The New Testament doesn't paint a picture of no suffering, no struggles in this world. It doesn't paint a picture necessarily of everything happening the way we expect it to. And I know that can challenge our faith and what it means to walk by faith as a Christian in this world. When we go through times of suffering, we maybe struggle with doubts and what did God really say? And am I really hearing God? And is God in this? And I haven't got time to go into it now, but I would recommend, this is a great little book called When Faith Fails, Finding God in the Shadow of Doubt. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. And he's an excellent tour guide. If you're struggling with your faith and you've got doubts and questions, or you've been through things where God hasn't seemingly come through for you, he'll help you sort of redirect your faith and grow it again, as it were. See, Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he did know the one that was going with him. And again, back to Jesus in Matthew 28, the Great Commission, Jesus says, I will always be with you. That is his promise. So we don't try to have more faith, we get to know God better. I'd encourage you to do that. That's how we grow our faith. And again, read the Gospels, read about Jesus, read the stories of the Bible. Allow them to feed your faith, as it were. And there's another good tour guide here. This is the last book I'll recommend today, but Dane Ortland, Gentle and Lowly. It's a superb book. This is about the heart of Christ for sinners and sufferers. If you've not come across it again, this will do you good. Recommend that if you want to get to know Jesus better. So faith hears and obeys. Faith steps out even when the way is unclear and unfamiliar. And thirdly, faith doesn't settle down. It doesn't get too comfortable. Did you pick up the reference in this to tents and camping? He left his home. He could have settled. I don't know what you're like with camping. I'm not the greatest fan. I'll go for a few days, but after a few days camping, I want a house with foundations and walls and a door and all the rest of it. It's more comfortable. I feel more secure in it. Whereas Abraham could have settled, but verse 9 says, by faith he lived as an alien in a foreign land, dwelling in tents. Dwelling in tents. That speaks of transitory. It speaks of passing through. It's not settling down. It's not putting down foundations in this world. And in the verses we read out, it's contrasted with the city, the place of permanence, the place of residence where there's foundations, and that's talking about the new heavens and new earth. And that's where a Christian's hope ultimately is, that we are passing through this world, that this world isn't our home. I can't remember who said it, but maybe it's C.S. Lewis said that, we don't have we don't make our home in this world, but we have a number of inns to stop in along the way, places to stay. And yet it's so easy to get kind of focused on this world and think this is it and to settle in our faith. I don't know if that's where you're at. Maybe you feel like you've kind of gone for it with God and then you kind of plateau a bit, and maybe it's as you get a bit older or something like that, but things just, what does it mean to still walk by faith and take those steps of faith, even into old age, to not live as though this world is our destination? It's not. I came across one prayer by a guy who's 89 years old, Oswald Sanders, and he prayed this at the age of 89. Oh God, don't let me waste my final years. Don't let me buy the American dream of retirement, month after month of leisure and play and hobbies and putzing around in the garage and rearranging the furniture and golfing and fishing and sitting and watching television. Lord, please have mercy on me. Spare me this curse. Of course, he's not saying that playing golfing, fishing, and these things are wrong. He's not saying that. Hopefully you hear the heart of what he's saying. And I hope if I hit 89 years old, that I'd be praying something similar to that. God, come on. Where's the next step of faith? Help me not to settle down and grow comfortable. Abraham left when he could have settled. And the final thing is this: faith continues to look to God in the face of the impossible. In verse 11 and 12, talked about by faith, even Sarah, after she received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead, as many descendants as the stars in the sky and the sand in the seashore. There's a fruitfulness beyond their ability as they looked to God. In Romans 4, it talks about Abraham as well, and says he looked at his body. It was like, no, good as dead. He looked at his wife, and it was like, no, this ain't going to happen. We're not going to have children. And we can do this sometimes. We look at ourselves and we think, no, I'm just too weak. I don't think I can do what God is asking me to do. I don't think I can step out in that way. The encouraging thing is so many of the examples we have in Hebrews 11 are men and women who are flawed, some who failed. Moses said, I can't speak very well, God. I don't think I can really do what you're asking me to do. Gideon was like, no, I'm too weak. I don't think I can do this. We often look at ourselves and we feel that way, yet verse 34 in chapter 11 says, from weakness they were made strong. That's God's promise to each one of us as we look to him. It says here that they looked to God, they considered him faithful, and they received ability beyond themselves to see God's promise come through, to see fruit come. That's just the way God works. He makes these promises and it kind of takes us to a dead end. It takes us to the end of ourselves because we cannot achieve it in and of ourselves. It is humanly impossible what God asks of us. And these Old Testament stories that we see with Abraham and Sarah, they point us to Jesus. And they point us to the cross where Jesus died. It seems like it's the ultimate dead end, and yet there's resurrection. And a Christian's faith, really, this is at the heart of Christian faith, that God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. That's our starting point for becoming a Christian. We're trusting God to do for us what we can't do, to forgive us, to help us, to save us, to rescue us, to redeem us. And he does that in Jesus. And as he does that, that's the starting point for our faith, and it's how we carry on in our faith as well. That we can't do it. It's humanly impossible for us, but we continue to look to God. And this strength, to walk by this kind of faith, to walk by the grace of God, doesn't come by focusing on ourselves, but by focusing on Jesus. If we feel weak in our faith, like I said, we don't start to look, well, how can I get more faith and muster it up within me? No, we consider Jesus. We look at Jesus. In fact, this is how Hebrews 11 goes into Hebrews 12. And it says this in verse 1 to 3. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. As we look at Jesus, he feeds our faith, he strengthens us, and he helps us walk this journey of faith that God's called us to in this new year. So we'll be strengthened in our faith by focusing on Jesus. And when we do that, God will work a fruitfulness in our lives that is beyond us. He'll work in a fruitfulness in our lives that is beyond our lifetime. Abraham didn't see all the descendants. He didn't see it all. He died beforehand. God works something in people together, not just individually, but together, fruitfulness beyond our lifetimes. And that's what our expectation is as we follow Jesus, as we take steps of faith. They may seem small, but as we take steps of faith, God works something huge among his people for the blessing of the whole world, basically. That's the way God works. And that's the way he'll continue to work this year through us as we trust him with our lives. So I'm going to pray, and Andy and the band, if you want to come back up, I think Marcus is going to lead us in communion, in breaking bread. I mean, what a great way to start the new year, really, if you're a Christian. As we take the bread and wine, it's that focusing in on Jesus. It's that considering Jesus. It's remembering who he is and what he's done for us. And Lord, I pray that this year, Father, for each one of us, that you would give us the grace. You would enable us to take steps of faith when we know we can't do it ourselves. But I want to pray for us, each one of us, to be strengthened by your grace and enabled to take steps of faith out of our comfort zones maybe this year into places. Keep us from settling down. Help us to take steps even when the way is unclear and we can't see the final destination or how it's going to pan out. And help us to trust you, Lord, even through the difficult times when our expectations maybe are not met. I thank you, you're with us in those times as well. You've been with us this year. You're never going to leave us. You're never going to forsake us. And you're going to walk through this year with us as well. And I just pray each one of us will know your closeness in Jesus' name. Amen. Over to Andy and the band.
Thanks so much.